Firstly, I'd like to thank the Learned Society of Wales for putting this on, and in particular the organisers, and for giving Angharad, Patrick and me the opportunity to discuss a topic that is very close to our hearts. So I'm Katrin Kohl. I'm at Oxford and specifically Jesus College, which is known as the Welsh College. And my field is German, but I've been spending and I grew up bilingually with German and English and school French and smatterings of other languages, but not as a very good linguist otherwise. But the last 4 years I've spent on a project called Creative Multilingualism, which has spanned many, many different languages, involved many excellent linguists, and something like, I think, 50 languages were somewhere in play. I'm honoured to be joined by two very special and illustrious people, both of whom, in fact, I met at Jesus College. Angharad, who I'm proud to have taught when she read German, and Patrick, who I had the great pleasure to work with when he was my French colleague at Jesus. So it's great to be coming together, even if only virtually this afternoon. We'll each be talking for around 10 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for questions. But first, I'd like to introduce Angharad and Patrick, since their work moving between academic pursuits and creative writing is very central to what is at the heart of this session. So Angharad is Professor in Welsh and Creative Writing at Bangor University. And after graduating in German, she did a doctorate in Celtic Studies on reading Robin Llewellyn. And she's the author of a multitude of academic books and articles on modern Welsh literature, and is also a widely acclaimed author of 2 novels and 2 collections of essays, one of which was published only last month. In 2002, she won the Prose Medal at the National Eisteddfod for the novel that was subsequently, fortunately for non-Welsh speakers like myself, translated by Lloyd Jones with the title The Life of Rebecca Jones. It was immediately hailed as a classic, and I commend it to you as just that. It's the most beautiful and moving book, capturing the spirit of Welsh heritage in very poignant prose, and through the lens of Angharad's own family. Patrick is Professor of French and Comparative Literature at St Anne's College, Oxford, has published numerous books and articles, editions and translations, focusing particularly on symbolist writers and modernism, including the book Poetry and Radical Politics in Fin de siècle France. He's a prize-winning author of 2 poetry collections, The Canals of Mars and Jilted City, and the memoir Other People's Countries, about the Belgian town where he spent part of his childhood. His novel, The Last 100 Days, about the final period of Romania's sinister totalitarian regime, which Patrick witnessed firsthand, was nominated for the Man Booker Prize. And his most recent novel, Throw Me to the Wolves, was published in 2019, and is about a real murder case in which an innocent suspect, a retired teacher, who I gather Patrick was in fact taught by in, as it were, real life, is subjected to a traumatic hounding by the press. So I think with both careers, we can see how language lives, cultural lives are sort of intersecting with writing, with linguistic creativity. Angharad and Patrick will give you glimpses of their creative writing at the end of the session after the Q&A. And I'm sure you'll feel at that point that your Christmas present problems are all sorted. I'm now going to kick off the discursive part of the discussion with some thoughts on intersections between language and creativity from a research perspective and with an eye to language learning. And I'm going to sort of pick up on some ideas that have come up earlier in the day about creating a multilingual ethos and engendering curiosity about languages and what I think we're particularly concerned about with our project of creative multilingualism is to build bridges between perceived monolingualism and multilingualism and language learning. So I'm now going to try and share my screen and see whether that works. So I hope this is giving you what you need to see. Starting off then with the creative dimension of our own languages, we think that this is particularly valuable and needs to be put at the heart of the way in which we see languages and see them as a foundation for language learning, and that language learning really thrives on being given scope for linguistic creativity. Worth remembering that we don't speak language in some kind of abstract way or some kind of universal way, but languages. We speak collectively thousands of languages. 7,117 have been counted by a very authoritative source, but that raises the question of what is a language, what is a dialect, what is a regional variety, and it's been suggested that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, which is a comment reported by Max Weinreich, but it's been much discussed. It suggests that language, when something becomes a language, it's because it has a certain amount of, as it were, political power behind it. So it's quite a provocative idea. So each one of us speaks and writes languages geared to the situation and conversation partner. For some of us, that might be more than one language. Some use more than one regional variety. Everyone uses more than one register, i.e. formal and informal, baby talk, jargon. And everyone has a distinctive idiolect, i.e. a personal dialect. So language teaching and learning, we might say, extends our innate multilingualism. We think with our languages. Here I've just sort of jotted down the kind of permutations that I was going through when I was thinking about this paper. And that means that really working and playing with language elements trains our mental agility. We think as we speak, and we speak as we think. We use metaphor provided by our languages to think, speak, and act. This is very much part of the ordinary fabric of our languages. If you look at two dictionary entries, so I've focused on the verb to see, so to perceive with the eyes, but used metaphorically as to perceive with the mind, to the point where we're not really even aware of the fact that this is a metaphor when we see, say, for instance, being. I've also picked out the object and metaphor of prism. So since that is very much central to the conference. So on the one hand, it was a figure, then it became transferred to geometry, to optics, and figure is used figuratively, as in this conference. So the vocabulary of a language is animated by metaphor through and through, and that can be an enormously inspiring resource for language learning. We invent language all the time. So this is something that inspired Chomsky to look for universal grammar. We can see it in word lists that are published by Oxford University Press every 2 or 3 months. So I've just picked out a few words here that were from September 2020. Some seem to be actually very well established already, and it's just taken the dictionary quite a while to catch up, like code switch or bactinian or deprioritize. Tat, I have to say, I had never come across because I probably move in the wrong circles. And crafternoon, I'd never heard of, but it's immediately obvious what it means. Currywurst, I know very well. It's a dish of German sausage covered in ketchup mixed with curry powder, which sounds absolutely disgusting, but my family love it. So we also create sentences all the time, and you can experiment with that in Google. If you put any phrase between 2 quotation marks, you can see how often it comes up. And you very quickly arrive at the point where, in fact, it has never been said before, or written before, rather. We play with our languages. Everybody loves language play. It's done across cultures, across languages, in various different ways, picking up on particular features of the language concerned and playing with those in particular. So punning is a very favorite English activity. For example, Christmas cracker jokes. So the one that I like best amongst this list is, why did Santa go to the doctor? Because of his bad elf. So there it's playing with homophones, but also with sort of register, with class prejudice, and so on. Language humor I would say, puts us in touch with our love of linguistic creativity, and we can use that to stimulate curiosity. We adapt our languages creatively to interact with the changing world around us, just like other animals, in fact, it would seem, because sperm whales use accents and regional dialects to distinguish their group from others. Baby goats, who were divided up into groups, were found to develop distinctive gang accents within just a month. Nightingales have been found to use well over 2,000 types of song, and that's just in Berlin. And a jazz musician found that when he played various instruments in the Berlin Tiergarten, a nightingale initially started jamming his signal, but then actually after a while became rather curious and then started joining in. Meanwhile, we can witness human groups responding to their own challenges as we speak in lockdown lingo. So that's happening across the world in all sorts of different ways, and it's happening in our midst. We're constantly coming across new words and have no difficulty understanding them and then beginning to use them ourselves. So we're continually being creative, as we can see from these kind of sort of examples. And so I'm just going to stop now and hand over to Angharad.
Diolch, Katrin.
Thank you.
Can everybody hear me?
Katrin.
Yeah. Rhys, ti yma'n cyfieithu?
Rhys, are you here translating?
Yeah, so Rhys is here as a translator. I want to thank Rhys for being here as a translator. Ond, ydych chi'n clywed y cyfieithu?
Do you hear the translation?
Can people hear the translation?
Testing, is it working?
I was going to explain to Rhys in any case that because we're discussing language and I'm paranoid about words being very slippery, and that because I'm a control freak, I'm going to speak in English in this session today, but I'm very happy to take questions and Gymraeg ar ôl
Welsh after the conversation, and I'll be reading in Welsh as well at the end.
Because I'm speaking in English, I've decided to put things down on paper, so I'm going to be partly reading this evening. So if you could forgive me if I'm glancing on my script every now and again. So when I was a child in the early 1970s, before I went to school, there was a popular television programme for children called Bydd. It featured a cartoon character, which was a small boy called Bydd, who lived with his aunt Flo. And most of the actions was conveyed through music, but I believe it was one of my first conscious contacts with the English language. When I mentioned my liking of Bydd many years later at university in England, the others didn't agree. They didn't like Bydd, they said, because nothing ever happened in it. This was true, plot wasn't a priority. But this hadn't bothered me. In my mind, Bydd's name, B-O-D, the word appeared on the screen, Bydd, was the same as the Welsh verb, to be. Bod, B-O-D. Bydd, therefore, by definition, wasn't meant to do anything. All he had to do was to be. That was his destiny, and he lived up to his name. Bydd just was. I'm mentioning this because I believe that my response to and understanding of this English language character was filtered through and affected by my mother language, Welsh. As a child growing up in a village in northwest Wales, Welsh was the only language I heard spoken around me 99% of the time. At home, on the street, in school, and even in the local town. Certainly for the first 5 or 6 years, until we started learning it, the little English any of us heard came from television. English was there, of course, in the air, but we rarely spoke it. Our so-called fluency was largely passive. Like Bydd's name, our English was filtered through and affected by Welsh. This gave very ordinary English words all sorts of fascinating connotations, frog and moron being two examples that spring to mind. I can elaborate on that later. This intermingling of languages and word associations, often completely subconscious, is apparently common to most bilingual or multilingual people. Recent research at Bangor University confirms this, especially if you've been bilingual from a young age. If we take creativity to mean the production or formation of something new, or of bringing together elements in a new way, then it would seem that bilinguals or multilinguals have a ready stock of striking images, connections, and wordplay at hand as possible raw material. Of course, it depends what you do with that raw material. Personally, I believe that its creative potential is in the end limited, but it is conducive to a certain type of creativity. What this point does not acknowledge is degrees of bilingualism and the fact that in the vast majority of cases, languages exist in uneasy power relations with each other in the minds of many bilingual and multilingual people. So I may sound fluent in English, but I'm much more fluent in Welsh. People often ask me why I don't write creatively in English. Bigger potential audience, more money, persuasive arguments. And there are many exophonic writers, Joseph Conrad, for example, or Chinua Achebe, who write brilliantly in their second or even third language. But for me, and this is purely a matter of personality, the question is a non-starter. It's to do with the inner ear. From birth, and certainly until adolescence, if not later, my most meaningful experiences happened through the medium of Welsh. This was the language of the family, the community I lived in, the schools I went to, the chapel I attended, the culture that surrounded me, TV, books, pop music, the language my grandparents reminisced in, the street language I learned, the language I first tried a cigarette or got drunk in, the language I heard world news or attended political rallies in, basically everything. And though English was there, my awareness of it was passive. So unsurprisingly, there isn't much of a contest when I write. Welsh is the raw material I draw on. Those are the words I hear. It's not that if I used English, I would be somehow lying. Writing is, of course, an artifice. But it would simply give me no pleasure. I love those Welsh words. I like their shapes, their sounds, their associations, and my inner ear hears them by people that I've known or people that I wish to know. Why would I deny myself the pleasure of using that living, raw material? Of course, I do find myself writing in other languages sometimes, in English or German or French, but even in English, which I know best of those three, even when I know what I want to say, the exact right word doesn't always come to me. I have a vague sense of its shape or sound, but I often have to reach for the thesaurus to discover the exact word, again and again and again. When I write in Welsh, the thesaurus is there, in my head or at the tips of my fingers. In fact, there isn't a thesaurus at all. It's just the words. So having established at the beginning that bilingualism or multilingualism is inherently creative, am I now saying that it makes no difference? Well, of course I'm not. Each language learned, each new perspective gained is enriching beyond belief. Our other languages continually transform and refresh our experiences. And I believe that one of the best ways of demonstrating this and the deep and vast creativity that exists in the exchange between languages is through translation. So I'm going to finish today with a couple of examples of how translation, or self-translation in this case, has revealed to me time and time again how creative multilingualism can be. My novel, Awduron, which Katrin mentioned earlier, translated later as The Life of Rebecca Jones, opens with a prose passage describing the course of a stream in the valley where the novel is set. Translating this passage with Lloyd Jones was an informative experience, because in Welsh, stream or brook, nant, is feminine. So descriptions such as mae hi'n llifo, mae hi'n byrlymu are natural and, for want of a better word, neutral in Welsh. That's how you describe something of feminine gender, flowing or bubbling. Later on, through the force of the grammar, the stream does in fact start acquiring a female personality. In the course of her descent along the valley floor, the stream is likened to a young girl or an old woman, and so on. In English, of course, there is no grammatical gender. So she became it, the brook or the stream. This was already different, and the seamless transformation into a female entity became a challenge. Narrative gymnastics was suddenly needed. The stream's personification as a female had to be made explicit, artificially, at the beginning of the description through the use of a simile. So the stream was like a young girl, and so on. Only then was there a basis for the use of the pronoun she. All in all, it seemed to create something, a conscious poetic device that emerged from the adaptation of the Welsh into English. And there were many more instances throughout the novel. It gave the bilingual reader a very creative experience. Now, later, the novel was translated into German, and this was even more interesting. Nant, which is feminine in Welsh, is in German Bach, and Bach, der Bach, is of course masculine. So it wasn't she flows, but fließt. He flows. The gender had changed, and the brook's identity was suddenly transformed. And the vague identification with a female protagonist of the book made rather complicated. A new dimension had been created through translation. And again, such instances were numerous and fascinating to work through. Recently, when I was translating one of my own essays into Welsh, from Welsh into English, I came across a related challenge. The original Welsh essay was about a country lane called the Clay Road, a lawn glai. Lawn in Welsh is feminine, so describing the lane as a she was not explicitly to personify it, it was merely to describe it. When translating into English, I tried to keep the neutral tone, so change the pronoun from she to it. But after I read the translation, it felt very odd, a bit cold, distanced, and didn't contain the warmth of feeling I thought was conveyed in the Welsh original. I realised that the grammatical she, though not explicitly a personification, really did contribute a sense of intimacy with the country lane, which was absent when I used it. So I then rather boldly decided to use she throughout, describing a country lane in English as feminine, as a she. But the resulting text was again different from the original. It was more poetic in some ways, and also stranger and more experimental sounding. Those are just a few examples of the creativity of translation, and I could, in fact, go on and on and on about the creativity of bilingualism and multilingualism. But I suppose to conclude, what I can say is that without them, without bilingual or multilingualism, none of what I've just talked about would exist.
Thank you. Should I speak now, Katrin? I can't hear anything.
Yes, speak, Patrick.
Sorry, thank you very much. It was very moving to hear Angharad talking. And this is the first time she and I have done an event together of this nature, or I think of any nature. And so hearing her speak has made me think a little bit about the things that I was going to say. And what I had intended to speak about, and I will do, but I'll diverge slightly, is how, in a very specific sense, coming to Wales and learning Welsh and bringing up Welsh-speaking children gave me a way of reconnecting with my own upbringing, which, as Katrin said earlier, was a Belgian upbringing. That is to say, I was brought up in a post-industrial town called Bouillon in Wallonia, which Angharad now knows very well. And I was brought up in a culture which was always very sure of itself. It was sure of several things. The main thing it was sure of was that it wasn't French, though it spoke French. We knew we weren't French. We knew we weren't in France. We knew that our culture and our habits were different, or we thought they were different, and thinking they were different made them different. We are 6 kilometers from the French border, and we had a very strong sense of ourselves. My grandparents, one of whom had never left the country, spoke a French that was very earthy and quite crossed by Walloon, which was the dialect which you still sometimes hear in that area, though less and less, and which still exists in these little very, very flowery, evocative pockets of ordinary Walloon Ardennes French. And this was my upbringing. And then I was sent to an English boarding school, which, apart from all the things that we know English boarding schools do, produce sociopaths and people who feel that they're entitled to rule the world. One of the things it did to me was essentially iron out everything that I had been before in ways that I didn't really notice. And so I went to do English at university, and I did a PhD, and I began writing in English, as I always thought I was meant to do, but with some strange disconnection. And that disconnection comes from the fact that the language that I felt in, and often still feel in, was French. And I didn't really know what to do with this. And it was like a strange energy that was not really going anywhere. And I still have today certain moments when I speak English where words, there's like a little speed bump that I see ahead because it's a word that I've never got. And I feel that I have to start slowing down when I'm speaking to give myself time to remember that word that has always caused me problems. That was how I learned English when I began. It was a pretty brutal way of learning in an English boarding school. And I had English that was essentially rusty without ever having shone to begin with. That's to say, I'd seen it on television. I'd spoken to my father in English, occasionally, not very much, because we spoke French at home. And yet now I find myself a writer in the English language. And I don't think I would have done that if I hadn't started learning Welsh. All of the things that I've written, my first book of poetry and my second book of poetry, my memoir, my most recent novel, are all somehow conditioned by my having learned Welsh, brought up Welsh-speaking children, and having stood somehow outside my Englishness, my imposed Englishness, and having refound my Belgitude. I would never, for example, have written my memoir, Other People's Countries, if I hadn't been able to come back to my old self, my old Belgian self, through the medium of Welsh. That is to say, by taking Angharad and my children to meet my family, to live in this house, and to tell them stories about my childhood that I had at some level repressed or kind of forgotten about. And there are strange things that still happen. Like my uncle, Jean-Paul, was a big fan of the Beatles. And when I was a child, I had his bedroom, and he still had graffiti about the Beatles and extracts from their lyrics written on the walls. And my grandmother used to call this band Les Beatles. It was never the Beatles, it was Les Beatles. And I still think of the Beatles, John, Paul, George and Ringo, not as the Beatles from Liverpool. I think of them as Les Beatles, whose lyrics I read on the wall of my Uncle Johnny's bedroom. And these things suddenly became, in retrospect, an important part of my childhood. They became part of me and a part of my experience in ways that have utterly defined my writing. To the extent, really, that I think that even though I'm not Welsh, I think of myself as a Welsh writer in the very specific sense that if I hadn't come to Wales, if I hadn't learned the language, if I hadn't lived my intellectual and emotional life somehow between the languages, I simply wouldn't have written. I would have continued writing academic books on French or on French literature, which is the day job. But I don't think I would have found that particular seam that enabled me to stand sufficiently outside both my French and my English to actually become a writer. And I'm not exaggerating, really, when I say that when I first began writing poetry in Cardiff, it came from a way of seeing double, seeing somehow the language doubled. I remember walking from our house in Clive Road in Canton to the centre of town and seeing words like canol, meaning centre, and then thinking that how it corresponded to calon, which means heart. And then I thought heart, centre, heart. And suddenly I thought these kinds of connections will enable me to write poetry. Another one, and again, Angharad promised to read you something. I will also read something later about calon and canol and cwmwl, cloud, and culum, knots and clouds. Suddenly, a whole set of interrelations became apparent within language that enabled me to start writing poetry. Not just poetry that described special feelings or narrated things, but poetry that somehow tried to get in under the skin of language and in the bits in between the languages that gave me one book of poems and then gave me a second book of poems because I went back and I did the same to my mother tongue, that is to say, French. And I began to kind of go for that seam as well and start writing about all I had lost through the many gains that I've made by becoming English, by becoming an academic, by becoming a professor at Oxford. And so in that sense, coming to Wales and in a very specific sense, learning Welsh has given me not just the old classic cliche, but true cliche of a window onto the world, as a small window that actually magnifies the world. But it actually made me go back over everything that I thought I knew, everything that I thought I had put in boxes, in the drawers called the past, and made them live again in ways that have hugely enriched me as a writer. In fact, they've made me as a writer, and also change the way I think academically too, change the way I write academically. So my experience of writing, in a sense, is very different from Angharad's. Although what interests me, and this is the kind of context in which I would say it to her, because I wouldn't say it to her in a normal conversation. Her novel, Chreadigrwydd, and which is a celebration of the place she comes from, has some correlation with my novel, with my memoir, Other People's Countries, which is about my home in Belgium and the way it's on the one hand gone, but on the other hand, still going on. And so those books kind of meet in a strange way, though they were written by totally different people who have no consciousness whatsoever of doing anything similar to each other. She may not agree, I'll find out later. But in a sense then, my tale of language and creativity is very different from hers, because for me, the ability to move between languages has given me really my subject. And for that, I'm very grateful. But it wouldn't have happened, I think, if I hadn't learned a third language in adulthood for emotional reasons. I think that's enough from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both. I think that was really lovely insights into very personal language lives, language journeys, writing journeys. And I think what it makes clear is that languages are deeply, deeply personal, and are enriched by personal lives, and that they are really absolutely fundamental to our identities. And I think that's a dimension that has really tended to get lost in the discussions around language learning in the UK and all the problems with it, and why people should learn languages and why it's terribly useful because it improves our economic performance and so on. I think that may all be right, but it completely loses sight of those deeper dimensions of language and I think that for me has been the tremendously enriching sort of journey that I've been on over the last 4 years, discovering many ways, as we've discussed amongst about a group of about 30 researchers, how languages intersect and how language intersects with creativity. And I think what we've just had is two very, very personal, very rich insights into ways in which languages intersect with identity and with identities, and how they transform identities and are in turn transformed by identities. So this is really now the chance for asking questions. There's plenty that Angharad, Patrick and I could discuss, but we'd love to hear from others in the audience, people who we can't see, but who have hopefully been seeing us, hearing us, and who might have ideas to contribute or questions. So I now have to look at these very complicated bits of text to see whether they yield questions. I can't see anything at the moment. So I've had a question from Chreadigrwydd. How can we mobilize this multilingual creativity in the classroom? Do either of you, Angharad, how would you answer that question?
Well, it depends which classroom. Are we whether we're talking about teenagers or young children or whatever. Young children are less inhibited. Yes, that's a hard one. I wonder if I'm ever dealing with children, especially, maybe younger children, but also older children, they can be terrified of words, terrified of language. They're scared that language is controlling them. But actually, I think they should be enabled to control. They should be enabled to control language. They should be told that they are in control. Whatever they do is right. I'm not sure. Patrick or Katrin, it's. I don't know. It's such a hard question.
I noticed that with my children, the children we have here, when they were younger, it was much more natural for them to speak to me in French, which I did for a certain amount of time with them. And then as they become teenagers, language begins to feel different to them. And I think that's what Angharad was referring to. What I do notice in university, and I'm sure that Katrin's had the same thing, is that I very often encounter people who are students in Oxford, not necessarily my students, who might actually speak 2 or 3 languages but don't consider themselves linguists. And that's because there's no real format for them to think of having languages really as a skill and as a potential. I had a couple of years ago a Romanian student who was doing French and Portuguese in Oxford, and she didn't even really think of the Romanian that she spoke at home as another language. It was just her, how she spoke to her parents. And yet she was quadrilingual with all of the potential skills and creativity that brings. And I don't know whether other cultures are better at valorizing people's bilingualism or multilingualism, but I don't think England's very good at it. It still sees it as a problem. What really annoys me, since we're on the subject and since you asked, is how in English newspapers, the number of languages spoken in the school are always, without exception, mentioned as a sign of that school's problems, its difficulties, its not being somehow right. Whereas when I hear that there are 26 languages spoken in one school, I think that's fantastic. Now, what can we do with that? But we live in a country where that's seen as a problem. And I think we could probably usefully try to change that culture in the small country that we live in now. Katrin, what do you think of that? Having worked on that?
Well, it's something that we've been doing with creative multilingualism, actually working in schools. We had 2 projects spring to mind. One was led by Matthew Reynolds and Kate Clanchy, who's a poet, and she went into schools and did workshops, so involving, for example, an Arabic poet or a Polish poet. And then children would write poetry in workshops, and they created pamphlets that were then distributed and that they were really proud of. Now, that was in a school, Oxford Spires Academy, which very definitely did value languages. And I think there are a lot of schools across the country, certainly across England, across Scotland, I would think, Wales, I'm sure as well, where languages are valued and where the multitude of languages is being given a higher profile. And I think for me, one of the real revelations of working on creative multilingualism was the way it changed my perspective from, on the one hand, seeing only the negative stories about how language learning in schools has diminished and how the number of A-level takers and GCSE takers have gone down. German has gone down and so on. And it's a very long story that goes back to 2000 and before. But actually, at the same time, the richness of languages within English schools, within UK schools, within British schools, has just burgeoned, so that it's very typical to have, you might have 100 languages in a school. So one school in Oxford has 100 languages. In other parts of the countries, it will be even greater. And schools are dealing with that. And actually, it does mean that young people are growing up with a multitude of languages around them.
Yeah.
I think what we need to do is break down the barriers between those languages and see them all, in a sense, as part of a live system where each language actually connects with other languages. And I think that's one of the things that we've been doing. With our research project, we very quickly came to the conclusion that to us, multilingualism wasn't speaking X number of languages and wasn't distinguishing multilingualism from bilingualism, from plurilingualism, and giving each one its definition, but that actually everyone is in some way multilingual, and bringing that out as a universal would put people in touch with each other and allow us to celebrate it in a much more lively way. And we had a wonderful, or still have, project called the Multilingual Performance Project. And the person who leads that, Daniel Tyler McTighe, who is himself based at the Birmingham Rep, or was, and is now in between various theatre institutions, he has put on fabulous workshops with teachers in order to get across that sense that actually through drama, you can bring out even a tiny amount of a different language can become something very important and can connect up with ways in which other people speak and so on. So I think there is some really, really excellent work going on, and we need to build on it and tell those positive stories as well as the negative ones. So I've had some more questions. First, perhaps, right, okay. We had one hand that was up, but now the person has unfortunately vanished. We've talked for too long. But I've also had, so Mairead Hopwood has observed that the economic arguments are not going to win people over to language learning, or at least not with any great success. What we need to do is motivate the emotional and positive attitude. And I think that's absolutely key. And Lucy Jenkins has got a question, which I'll read out. So, to what extent are we surprised that language learning has become undesirable when the personal stories we've just heard are, in a sense, locked out of the classroom via the curriculum? How do we reinsert these personal stories into the classroom in order to motivate? And how do we support this self-expression? And do we think that personal identification with language or languages is indeed a motivation stimulus more broadly for young people? Is that something, Angharad, do you have any take on that?
Well, I think it's so important to stress that bilingualism or multilingualism is the norm across the globe. And I think if that message was delivered to classrooms across the UK, because there is definitely, at least in parts of the UK, a weird idea that somehow having one language is the basic fact, and then the people who have more than one are somehow slightly freaky. But bilingualism is the norm across the globe, and if people could be told that maybe more powerfully through personal stories, maybe, or just by through visits by writers or whoever, anybody charismatic enough to carry that message around schools and even to other adults. I mean, it's not just the schools we need to educate; it's the adults as well, and to tell them that being bilingual is nothing anybody needs to fear or fear from, and that it's actually a very natural state of affairs.
Mm. Well, of course, in a sense, in the British Isles, we have so many languages that are sort of coming in from different periods in the various countries' histories and the way in which they intersect, and now all the different ways in which migration is happening. I mean, one thing I've noticed is that by comparison, I mean, I think, Patrick, you asked whether England, the UK, the British Isles are particularly bad at getting this kind of message across, and perhaps so England is in a sense the most challenged. But I think one thing I have noticed is that the Commonwealth has meant that, and the way in which the Commonwealth has interacted with British history has meant that actually there is a very strong sense of other cultures being sort of interwoven with our own. And we see it all around us in a way that, for instance, in Germany, you don't get that same effect. And I think this is something that we need to build on. There is actually quite a considerable tolerance towards multiculturalism. What we need to do is connect that with a sense of multilingualism being part of that multiculturalism, which is absolutely natural to our society.
Yes, I mean, it's always easier, isn't it, to eat multiculturally than it is to learn languages. But I hear what you're saying about the British situation, especially as someone who deals with the French. I mean, the French are not at all hospitable either to their own languages, their own indigenous languages, or to the ones that belong to the countries that they have in different ways colonized. So what I say about Britain is not unique to Britain. I suppose I was objecting to the tendency among the press and many politicians to continually see the number of languages and cultures in any given school as a marker of that school's disadvantagedness. And I think that one of the things about the way languages need to be taught and valued in schools is as intrinsically creative and goods in themselves, rather than things that will necessarily get you from one place to another. We need to break down that whole utilitarian language, which by which things become somehow skills. And I think there's another thing, actually. I mean, lots of students in schools now who might once have been drawn to studying languages thanks to things like literature and culture are often put off, I think, by the frequent banality of what they have to do at GCSE and A-level too. And that probably also needs to change. I'm not saying that things were better before. They weren't. They were drastically unequal from an Oxford perspective. But I think that a lot of people who love literature and love ideas are frozen out of language study because they just don't see it represented in the coursework that they have to do. And I think that's a shame.
So we've had some more questions here. So Joe Boyle says language is about creativity, but it is also about craft. And might it make sense to talk about craftful multilingualism? I think that goes very much to the heart of some of the questions. I mean, for example, around gender, these are the things one has to learn if one's learning a foreign language, but it then also has a very different dimension that is actually also connected to that. So I think perhaps craft is something that we might think about, and we might think about instead of just thinking about skill. So I think there's food for thought on that concept. And then there's another question which to some extent goes into in the same direction, and I think speaks to something that you were talking about, Angharad. So do you think that translation apps give people an excuse not to learn a language, or that it devalues language learning to some extent? So, Angharad, what would you feel about language apps in the classroom?
Well, there's a place for apps. There are wonderful apps out there. Even Duolingo is amazing. You can have access from the palm of your hand to all sorts of languages, and you don't need to be, if you're shy or if you're, you can just learn languages through apps, and I think that's absolutely brilliant. But there are other forms of learning languages as well, and yeah, I'm not sure.
I mean,
Truly, anything that helps us know something more after we've done it than we knew before we did it has got to be good, hasn't it? I have a Catalan and a Spanish app on my phone, plus some German verbs. I'm not sure they've enabled me to improve, especially not on the German, I'm sorry to say, Katrin, but they've been useful to me and put me into positions either of imaginative engagement with the language or pragmatically helped me in a situation when I was buying something or ordering something. So I'm a big fan of them.
When you learn a language, you have to put effort in. It's not going to happen easily. Learning a language is hard work, but apps can help you along the way. And there comes the point then when you have to take your own initiative and decide what you're going to do with that basic knowledge. So, you need both.
Yes, and that picks up again on the craft idea, isn't it? I mean, you don't have a craft just by dabbling. You need to really work at it. And with translation apps, I mean, one could say that actually they also highlight what the limits are of the automatic translation or the corpus-based translation. That actually, in the end, every piece of language is something unique, something original, and if you then see what the app doesn't do, that can actually stimulate creativity. So I think there is a place, and that it's really both the creativity and the craft that we need. I think we had, and somebody suggested that the notion of wordsmith comes in as well. And also another question has asked about what role we see for children's books with original language and translations, and how writers can contribute to language learning. So I think perhaps we'll leave that, as it were, in the air, and instead of discussing it theoretically, we will now go to your readings. Which of you wants to go first?
Angharad, do you go first?
Okay. I'm a bit worried about time. Do we have to finish at 6 o'clock?
I believe we don't have to finish on the dot.
Okay. Okay, it'll be good. Okay. Well, I'm going to start reading in Welsh. And Katrin, this is about the person who taught me German before I got to you. And it's my first German teacher. You were my second German teacher. This is René. And it's from an essay that I've just published. And it talks about going to her house to have my German lessons, and stepping into her kitchen, and the disparity between the comfort and the interest of being in René's kitchen, and then the torture of having to do German grammar. So I'm going to start off reading in Welsh, where I'm describing the atmosphere of the kitchen, and then I'll just, after a paragraph, I will go into English, which I've translated myself. So this is an essay about learning a third or a fourth language, which I wrote originally in my first language and which I'm now going to read in my first and second language. So I'm hoping it's topical, if nothing else. Mae'r gair Almaeneg gemütlich yn un anodd I gyfieithu, ac ymhlith I ystyron mae cartrefol, cysurus a chlyd. Mae'n seiliedig ar yr enw gemüt a all olygu anian, natur, calon, a hwnnw'n I dro yn hanu o'r un gwraidd ar gair mood yn Saesneg. Haws o lawer fyddai disgrifio I ogla. Ogla cinnamon a cloves, ogla croen lemon a menyn, twtsh o oglau coffi, oglau hen lyfr a coginio a cherdyn post o Albania, ogla gwres raven, ac ar ymylon y cyfan chwa o bersawr rif gosh. Nid yr ogleuon hyn yn unigol, ond y cyfuniad ohonyn nhw. Dyna ogla gemütlich I mi. Dyna oedd ogla cegin René. Yma yw chartref yn Fron Heulog y down bob wythnos pan oeddwn yn y 40au gael fy nhormentio gan ramadeg Almaeneg. Roedd na dyndra rhyfedd rhwng y cysur o gamu dros y trothwy I mewn I gegin gynnes René a'r awr o artaith feddyliol y gwyddwn oedd o'n blaen. When she reached out for the course book, a frightening hardback yellow affair, complete with a title, Heute Abend, written in Gothic print, I knew that an eternity of hard mental struggle lay ahead of me. It wasn't the long composite nouns that bothered me. Those were a doddle for someone brought up near places called Llanfairysgair and Penis Arwain. And there was no challenge as a Welsh speaker in producing the guttural consonant and the open vowels of spoken German. But as for the syntax, German sentence structure, which seemed to me to have been deliberately invented to impede comprehension, produced nothing less than angst in me. I very nearly gave up. But then, some 3/4 of an hour into the bowels of some subordinate clause, there came an escape. René would turn and ask in an English that sounded rather upper crust to me because of her staccato enunciation, "Would you like a cup of coffee?" And so I would lean back in my chair in the heat of the Reben and watch René moving through her kitchen. She would reach first of all for the coffee. Not your jar of Nescafe granules, which we all drank in those days, but a tin filled with white wings made out of paper, whose edges she would carefully fold before placing it in her coffee machine. She'd then spoon ground coffee beans into the filter paper, always managing to spill some over the sides, at which point she'd start uttering German expletives under her breath. As the smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, René would disappear into her pantry, re-emerging with a dented biscuit tin in her hands, lifting the lid as she came back towards the table. And there before me lay a feast of baked German delicacies, of rich brown gingerbreads and golden shortbreads, of Lebkuchen or Streusel, slices of baked cheesecake or moon-shaped almond biscuits, all baked in her kitchen, which had, in the meantime, taken on the smell of those ingredients. It was so hard to choose, but whatever treat was on offer that week, I knew as I took the first bite that my senses would be open to flavours never tasted before, unknown combinations of spices, of hazelnuts roasted, the indescribable taste of ground poppy seeds, of sour cherries or raisins soaked in rum, of cream cheese baked with lemon, of cardamom, ginger and nutmeg. It was the taste of another tradition. And as those flavours combined with a bitter coffee in my mouth, I would slowly understand that this was more than 5 minutes break from work. I was savouring another culture. Travelling the 4 miles back from Sling to Bethel after the lesson, I felt as if I wasn't just moving between 2 slate quarrying villages. I was also moving between 2 countries, 2 traditions, 2 inheritances, which, like René's kitchen, with its German atmosphere and Welsh furniture, were nevertheless synthesized, composite, united as one in something new. And the lessons continued.
I'm going to read just a couple of extracts. It strikes me, hearing Angharad, that my little reading also begins in the kitchen, and I wonder how many languages actually start in kitchens with grandparents or people that we know or neighbours, and through cooking. This is an extract from other people's countries, which is called Pissing in Your Chips. One of the most evocative confusions occurred with the passage of my father's favourite expression, to piss in your chips, into French. For years, I heard pisser dans ses frites used about people who had messed something up or harmed their chances of getting a job or earning some money. In short, people who'd shot themselves in the foot, which is what it means. Since I only ever heard the expression in French, I thought it was a French term, a Belgian term, not only that, but a Bouillonnais one, part of the heritage patois we all trafficked in. If anyone anywhere was going to be pissing in their chips, it would be us here in Bouillon. I heard my grandparents, aunts and uncles, even our neighbours use the expression, until pisser dans ses frites belonged in my mind to Bouillonnais and to Bouillonnais only. Only much later, when I was testing it out on some young Arelonais in my early teens, did I realise that the phrase was in fact my father's exotic Geordie import that had grafted itself onto Bouillonnais French and briefly flourished on its branch among people who took their chips seriously and for whom the expression seemed so well designed that it was impossible to imagine it being anything other than theirs. But really, I had simply caught it for the length of its brief life in our language, and though I try sporadically to revive it in Bouillon or to plant it further afield in the French-speaking world, all the dictionaries assure me that it never existed. And yet, it seems an oversight here in this country whose great symbols are the mannequin piece, the only world tourist attraction that's smaller than the souvenirs that replicate it, and the baraque à frites, the chip stall. A combination of the two would surely become, in turn, the very symbol of national disaster. T'as bien pissé dans tes frites, la vieux. You've well and truly pissed in your chips there, mate. And I'll finish with a little poem which is also happens between languages. It's called Colum, which means not. It's got several Welsh words in. It's self-explanatory. It's about the moment when you're learning a language where instead of seeing things doubled, as it were, you start to see them twice. Colum was the knot the language had me in, the tangle-throated syllables of villages and streets. I saw double before I learned to see them twice. Then the road signs started to take root. The place names lifted off the letters that composed them, as in films the spirit leaves the body. Calon into canol, heart into centre, fluent as a stencil peeling back to leave itself behind. Adar, aderin, with the bird's Clément Ader's aeroplane translated. The word's idea of flight joining coast to coast in the dangerous, sustaining air. Now, from the geiriadur, the words take off. The dictionary empties, page by page, letter by letter, column by column. Thank you.
Thank you both. I think that was a lovely way to finish this session, which I certainly greatly enjoyed. And thank you very much indeed for all the audience questions. I think we could have carried on for considerable time, but it's time to wrap up now. So thank you everybody for participating and for coming, as it were, virtually to this session. And tomorrow there will be obviously further riches, which I'm sure you will be wanting to enjoy. And meanwhile, bye-bye and good night.